Okay, so welcome again to the CalOES Sexual Assault Training Standards, Materials, and Methods, Session 1. I'm going to hand it over to Leah to get us started.
Thank you very much. I can't see. I have to do a better job of that. So welcome everyone to our CalOES Sexual Assault Training Standards and Materials and Methods, Session 1. We will, as mentioned, I'm looking at July 15th, and that's my birthday, so I'm a little shocked when I see July 15th written down somewhere, so you'll forgive me for that. But we are moving through consecutive days for the training. Sarah, am I supposed to be able to advance the slides?
No, you have to let me know and I will do it.
Oh, okay, very good. Okay, great. Can you go ahead and advance the next slide? Fabulous. Okay, so this 5-session virtual training series will move things out of the way. Right. Okay, so we're basically going to cover many of the training standards. We'll give you an update on the training standards and a little bit about that process and some of the intent behind updating the training standards, and which was done in conjunction in partnership with member programs and folks at CalOES. So we'll cover that. That's the purpose of the training overall. And I want to emphasize that this is covering the training standards, not the actual tools or exercises or activities that you would use to implement the standards, but it's to ensure that everyone knows what those changes or reframes are as a result of this work, this update with CalOES, okay? We want to make sure that we are pointing out the various advocacy training topics in the training guide, again, and it's really an answering of the why certain areas have been highlighted or pulled out and or elevated, and paying attention to those as you all prepare to do your advocates trainings. And we want to make sure that people are aware of what needs to happen for compliance and for your certification for your sexual assault program or your rape crisis center. And then what are some of the specific particulars that CalOES has outlined or underlined rather, or highlighted in terms of what you need to do to be in compliance, such as the amount of media that you use or don't use, time allocations, requirement of expert people with content expertise, and making sure that we're paying attention to or being inclusive with diverse or special populations. I also want to point out that this project is supported by funding awarded by the Services Training Officers, Prosecutors, or the Stop Violence Against Women Funds grant through the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, otherwise known as CalOES. And to be clear, that the opinions, findings, and conclusions of this particular project are those of CalCASA and not necessarily those of CalOES. CalOES reserves a royalty-free, non-exclusive, and irrevocable license to reproduce, publish, and use these materials, and authorize others to do so as they see fit. Thank you for that. So, Sarah, can we advance the slide? Next slide.
So session 1 learning objectives, as Leah said, we have kind of our overall learning objectives, what we want folks to be able to walk away with and implement following the entire series, and then learning objectives that are specific to what we're going to be covering today. So what we're hoping folks will walk away from after our session today is that you'll be able to identify the training standards and requirements related to an overview of sexual assault and discrimination and anti-oppression, including how these topics really fit into the larger context of sexual violence work and the sexual assault counselor training. So not only are we going to be covering the regulations and the standards, we'll also do some kind of contextualizing of that as well. Secondly, we're hoping that folks will be able to leave and describe strategies to achieve compliance with the standards in Units A and B of the California Sexual Assault Training Standards guide. So we'll be looking at both of those things today. I do want to mention at the end, we'll be putting a survey link in the chat. We'll be doing a survey at the end of each one of our sessions. And we'd really like for folks to be able to fill that out as you're able to. That way we can kind of make adjustments if we need to based on your feedback, what worked, what did you find challenging about the session as we go through. And then we'll have a conclusive survey as well. So keep an eye out for that at the end. And as always, we really do appreciate and take into consideration your feedback. All right, back to Leah.
Okay, so if you are not familiar with this document, thank you, Sarah. If you are not familiar with this document, or this looks like it might look familiar, there is a form that all of the rape crisis centers and sexual assault programs have that has to be completed, right? And this is a way in which you are able to make sure as you build your trainings out that you are indeed in compliance with the requirements, the training standards and requirements as enumerated by CalOES, okay? And you will see in your document, in the form that is issued, and someone, if you don't have it, someone in your organization does. If it's not your ED or CEO, it might be your grants management person, whoever who generally deals with maybe contracts with CalOES and the like. So, but as a training or facilitator or your volunteer coordinator or your volunteer training advocates trainer, whatever, however you configure that position, you want to make sure that you are aware as you're designing your training, the amount of time that must be allocated and that you are covering the topics and the subject matter in accordance to CalOES. You will have one of these for each of the 11 units, right? So there's a section for each of these and the like. Now, I will say this, most of us do not design our trainings in the sequence or the order in which CalOES has outlined these units, right? So they'll have unit A and unit B, unit C, but sometimes you may want to pull unit A, item unit A4 and put that in maybe unit K, right? So however you design your training based on what works for you, you just want to make sure that you're covering all of the areas. Now, I see that someone has said that the training this certification has changed. Has the training application changed since last year? I want to say that the update, right? They hadn't updated the standards since 2011. So the update process happened during 2017 and they were finalized in 2018. So if you are operating from a document that was issued and delivered in 2018, you are up to date, right? The certification process only has to happen once you, and the certification process happens when either one, you change something significantly different from what is already in the standards. Say for whatever reason, it's important that you cover a different topic or you need to spend more time in a certain area because that's what's important to your local community. You have to submit that in writing to CalOES to make that kind of a change for your particular agency or sexual assault program. So you will have to go through recertification should you change something significant in the lineup, or if CalOES makes a change. So CalOES made the change 2017, 2018, and that necessitated people kind of refiling and resubmitting for certification. If you have already done that from the 2018 period, you do not need to do it again. Again, and like I said, unless CalOES makes a change or you are making some kind of a significant change within your own organization because you need to respond to, say, for example, respond to a particular need in your local community, and that needs to take up a certain amount of time. For dual agencies, obviously, this is applying to the 40 hours associated with your for your training around sexual assault issues. So very good. How long does there's a question over here. There's a question, how long does a recertification process take if we wanted to make changes, something significant? If you're, I would give yourself at least 60 days before you plan on starting your training, because CalOES, whenever we want to submit something for approval, it's no less than 45 days. So if you're planning on doing it for this fall or what have you, you want to give yourself at least 2 months. And even now under COVID-19, if you can kind of project out that far, try and give yourself 3 months. I know that sounds ridiculous, but okay. So next slide, please. Okay, so what's different? We'll spend a little time talking about what's different. This is what we had, we've been operating with since 2011, right? So we basically had many familiar topics, and they were kind of organized along the lines of looking at what survivors needs, in terms of what advocates need to do to understand and work with survivors, and then what advocates need to know when working as an advocate with other responders, right? Other folks who are on deck to respond to issues of sexual assault, sexual violence, right? So we'll see that it was kind of configured that way. And you will note that many of, as we go to the next slide, you will note that many of the topics remain the same, but that there are some additions and some changes in 2020. So for example, if we look at Unit B, the inclusion of role plays under the discrimination and oppression chapter. Back in the day, sometimes we used to handle this, we used to call this cross-cultural day or cross-cultural education day. It has evolved over time, but one of the things that was missing was that advocates were not given, or typically were not required to practice how to and internalize the concepts and the ideas associated with the discussion around discrimination and oppression, right? So they inserted that there is a requirement now that role plays be handled around that topic, okay? You will note that when we're looking at the medical, it's required that we are looking at best practices for working with diverse populations when having a medical response to sexual assault, and so on and so on. So we have inclusion in Unit E, where we're talking about crisis intervention. Now, standard to that conversation is a discussion around identifying and responding to sex trafficking, right? So there have been updates that have happened as a result of, 9 years going by before we did the update. So it's nice to confirm that some of the old information or previous information still holds true. And then, then we realize where we need to grow or make changes or extend our offerings. So this is what's different. So if we could go to the next slide, please.
Okay, so we can see by the graphic in the upper right-hand corner that we have a polling question coming up as promised. So we would like to know if folks have a training coming up. Obviously, it is very uncertain time, so we're just kind of trying to get a temperature check, and for the group to know as well who has kind of abandoned the training for now until things become a little bit more clear, or if you have something coming up. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. The way that that works is when I launch it, you will see a box with a list of potential answers and the questions. Please select your answer. I'll be able to see them. And then when I close the poll, I'll be able to share that result so we can all kind of see where each other are at with that. So I'm launching the poll now. You should see that box come up on your screen. The question is, do you have a sexual assault counselor training coming up? We have no, not in the foreseeable future. Yes, in roughly the next 1 to 3 months. Yes, in roughly the next 3 to 6 months, or undecided, not sure. Either you all at the agency haven't made the decision yet, or you're not the person who is in charge of scheduling the training, so you're not really sure when the next one is. So please go ahead and answer that as you're able to. And just a quick note on polling questions as well, not that it particularly matters for this question, but this is all anonymous. So folks won't be able to see how each other answered. I can't even see who's answering what. I see kind of the same thing that you all see when I share the results, and you'll be able to see on your screen what that looks like, but nobody's name or organization is attached to any of our this or subsequent polling questions. Okay, it looks like we have about 85% of folks who have voted. If you have not done so, please go ahead and do in the next 5 seconds, and then I will be ending the poll and sharing the results. Okay, closing the poll. And you should see the results on your screen right now. So it looks like the vast majority, 64% of folks have a training coming up the next 1 to 3 months. Second and third runner-up are folks aren't sure, or in the next 3 to 6 months. And only a couple folks don't have a training coming up in the foreseeable future. So thank you for sharing. Okay, so oops, sorry about that. I've lost my information bar. I wonder where that went. Sorry.
Just while Sarah looks for her information bar, I do have a question for some of you who have dropped in the chat box that you are either currently doing trainings on Zoom, or some of you are interested in maybe doing some shared training because of everything being done virtually. And so if we could, if you, can people unmute themselves and we could spend a few minutes talking about what people's experiences have been thus far in terms of doing your virtual, virtual, people are looking to share. What kinds of things are you looking to share? What kinds of activities are people looking to share that you think that you could do across a couple of agencies, a couple of organizations? You want to?
Leah, this is Rocky.
Hi, Rocky.
Hey, I think I missed half of your question, but I just know that we already had, when this shelter in place happened, we had just begun our training. So then we just moved it to a virtual, we did it through Zoom. And we continued it that way. And because no one can sit at their computer for 8 hours a day, like they want us to, it just, instead of 4 weeks, it took us 7 weeks. We did it between 3 and 4 hours a day. It was great. All the speakers loved it. It was about, for me, I knew that most of the speakers had never used this platform before. So I did a lot of one-on-one with them, just kind of, this is how we use it. This is how you use it on your device, because everything looks different on everybody's device. Kind of practiced a couple of things, how they could share their PowerPoints and whatnot. And it was great. It was really, I was amazed how much, it just felt more intimate, I think, you know, which was kind of trippy, which I really loved. As Leah knows me. Anyway, we'll go down another.
And you're rural too, right? I mean, you have access.
You know, we are rural frontier, and we have been trying to use this format for decades. Yeah, and it was like, nice. No. And so, but for us, it's been amazing, not only because we take care of almost 6,000 square miles, and it might take someone 2 hours to get to us, but, you know, we have a lot of people economically that are challenged. And so it's been wonderful to be able to train people from the whole entire area on the Zoom. You know, obviously when all the technical glitches that happen, my one-to go-to is always, okay, y'all, it's just reminding us, you know, that we really have no control of anything. So let's let it go, you know? So it's just, that piece has been interesting. And then we've moved it to doing community education, and we've also used it with counseling. So it's an incredible format. And the more I learn about it, you know, I do know that if anybody's using an iPad, there are things you can't do on an iPad that you want to get a big notebook for. So, you know, in that respect, it was pretty awesome. So for us, it was really amazing. And we're planning another one to start either the last week in July or the first week of August.
Excellent. Can I get one more person that has launched a training via Zoom?
Leah.
Yeah.
This is Sonia.
Hi, Sonia.
Hi, how are you? We were 3 weeks into the training when this all happened. So we had people who saw what it was like to be face to face in training and then having to go Zoom. They were really good and very patient in waiting for us to kind of develop everything and get the speakers. But it's going way better than I thought it was. You know, I thought it was going to be. It was a little frightening at first, but everybody's there. We thought that maybe the 3 hours online it was going to be difficult for people, but we have a break in between, and they're very committed to that, and they're very, you know, they're participating. The chat helps for them, you know, being able to, you know, ask some questions. It's gone way better than we thought. So we are going to do another one beginning of September. So we're looking to see what were the kinks in here. And I'm glad you said about, Rocky said about the iPads, because yeah, the technical piece is some people, you know, they lose their connection or they're just on the phone. And I really, really want to let them know this time, for those that are going to take it, please plan on having your face on there, because it makes a difference in you giving a training and talking to the participants and being able to see them in their reaction. Because, you know, through the training, we always have our eye on those participants to see, you know, who may be hitting triggers or, you know, how they're reacting. So it's important that we see people when we're doing those trainings, and that's the challenging part. I would say that not everybody shows up on there. So I want to say that become kind of that we require them to be able to do that, to take this training. But overall, it's going pretty good. They do want to meet once, you know, they want to be able to do a face-to-face meeting, social distance. And I said, well, we have to wait and we'll do it and maybe do like a little graduation or something. But overall, it's been a pretty good experience. I have to say it's better than I thought.
Great. Thank you so much, Sonia and Rocky. I think that those are two great examples of how people just kind of without missing a beat, jump into the new technology. I will say this, if you are the host, please figure out a way to ground your internet connection. So that means plugging into a modem, plugging into a wall with an Ethernet cable, usually instead of Wi-Fi. So if you're the host, you want to try and make sure that you're using you're plugging in. Okay, thank you for that. Sarah?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for sharing, everyone. Okay, so we're gonna jump into a second polling question. We would like to see who's on the call and hear about what the position at your agency is. So I will be going ahead and launching our second poll. Should see that on your screen. So the question is, what best represents your position at your agency? Looks like the question got cut off. So what is your job role? Advocate or SART coordinator, maybe you're an advocacy coordinator or manager, or a training coordinator or manager, or perhaps a volunteer coordinator or manager. I know that all of those things can be kind of interchangeable, but different places call them different things. Maybe you're a grant manager or an HR person, an executive director, or something else entirely that we left out. And if that's the case, please let us know in the chat what you got going on. We have crisis service manager, prevention folks, great, program director. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and end this poll in just a few seconds. So if you haven't participated and would like to, please let us know. Okay, I'm sharing the results. You should see that on your screen now. Interestingly enough, it looks like about 30% of folks did not fit into any of these job descriptions or job titles, which surprises me. But it looks like we have mostly training coordinators and managers, some volunteer coordinator folks, a good number of advocates. So really a couple EDs, which is great. Mixed bag for sure. No grants managers though, so interesting. All right, thanks for letting us know, everyone.
Ooh.
Okay, so we are going to go ahead and jump into the certification standards put out by CalOES before getting into our units. So there are a couple things to know, just some general information. Leah already covered completing the application and the information that goes into that with the image that you saw on the screen a few slides back. Leah also mentioned that it is a minimum of 60 days should be allowed for review and modifications and ultimately approval. Once approved, the sexual assault training certificate on the bottom of the application cover will be signed, dated, and at that time it will be returned to your agency, and a copy will be kept on file at the CalOES sexual assault unit. As Leah also mentioned, special populations need to be covered, considerations for special populations, I should say, need to be covered in each unit. Special populations include typically those who have marginalized identities. So this can be anywhere from people of color and cultural considerations, immigrant communities, undocumented populations, older adults, sex workers, queer and trans folks, youth, all of the above. So we really want to make sure that we're not falling into only training on that kind of one size fits all model of advocacy, and that as the trainers, we're really doing our work to educate ourselves on this so that we can have that show up in all of the units of training. And so on that application, you're also going to want to let CalOES know how you intend to incorporate special populations again into all units. One more note is that make sure that you're attaching your full course agenda to your application, and that of course topics on the course agenda must match the required Unit A through K topics that are indicated on the application. And as Leah said, you can kind of mix and match and mess with the order a little bit, as long as everything is there. That's what's most important. In regards to evaluation, of course, you're going to want to figure out some way to evaluate your volunteers or your participants. Just something to note there is that while evaluation like pre and post tests are really important, that they can't exceed more than 2 hours out of the 40 hours worth of training. A note on absences. Just as same as always, absences, missed sessions by the volunteers can be made up on an hour-for-hour basis as follows. So, excuse me, no more than 20% of the entire course might be or is able to be made up. So if during the interview process, someone says that they can't commit to attending at least 80% of the training and you're not willing to make that 20%, then obviously they're not a great fit at that time. Obviously for dual essay and DV trainings, that 20% only applies to the sexual assault portion of the training. And makeup sessions can be conducted in a variety of ways. You could do a one-on-one review and discussion of the class content. And again, making sure that it's hour for hour. So if you have a 3-hour course that somebody missed on a Tuesday night, then the makeup session still needs to be 3 hours, and that includes discussion of the content. Okay, let's see. Also, we have subject matter experts that are required in several of the units. They are only required in 4 out of the 11 units. So we can see here that where we're going to need to bring in subject matter experts is in Unit E, which is crisis intervention, particularly related to suicide prevention. We have Unit H, which is medical. So a professional such as a SANE or another medical professional who specializes in sexual assault would be your subject matter expert for Unit H. We have Unit I, which is law enforcement, and J, which is legal and court. So these are the four categories that require a subject matter expert. Of course, a lot of folks decide to use subject matter experts for other units as well, just kind of depending on the content. But these are the only 4 places where it's actually required. And then lastly, we'll kind of get back to subject matter experts. We have a question for you all in just a moment, but I will finish out this section by saying just a few notes on the media allowance and exceptions. The maximum percentage of AV tools allowable for the entire training is 10%. And again, that's just for the 40 hours for essay if it is a dual DV-essay training. So 10% of the over 40 hours. As we go through the units, we will let you know on the title slide how much media can be allocated for that particular unit. Now that math, of course, is if you are using, kind of an even breakdown of 10% of each unit. Of course, this is overall, so you can use no media in one unit and then use double media in another unit, just as long as the overall isn't more than 10%. But again, we'll be kind of giving you an idea of how much that is per unit if you were to distribute that 10% evenly against all of the units. Now, there are a couple exceptions to what counts as media. There are 2 DVDs. Well, I shouldn't say 2 DVDs. I guess one is a DVD and one you can find on YouTube. And these 2 videos are the Learning Our Legacy video, which you can show to talk about the history of the movement, the sexual violence movement, and then the Compassionate Care DVD, which I'm sure 99% of you have, which is of course about the forensic examination process. So those 2 videos do not need to be factored into your overall media usage, and PowerPoint doesn't count as AV. So anything outside of those 2 things that I just named is not part of your 10%. So that's additional. So I'm going to launch a poll very quickly and see, we're interested to know what kind of access folks have to subject matter experts. So again, you can still see on the screen the subject matter experts that are required. You should see that poll appearing on your screen right now. Do you have access to subject matter experts?
And while you're all responding to the poll, there's some interesting comments over in the chat box. Folks use different kinds of platforms other than Zoom. Some people use Microsoft Teams, other folks are using Google Classrooms. And maybe we can at some point in time do a training on the different platforms and their pluses and minuses. Some of you are using a combination of platforms between, and you're using synchronous training and asynchronous. Perhaps you're making recordings and then uploading them and making them available for viewing at a different time. I'd be curious to know more about that. And CPE-DV's 13 modules that someone mentioned that, not someone, Brittany Ray. Hi, Brittany. Brittany Ray mentioned triggers for the virtual training. So that was a struggle. So at some point we should probably address how to handle people being triggered when they are safer at home, right? And don't have immediate access to that kind of intervention and support from the training team, perhaps. We have a lot of different positions that are joining us. So we have SADV counselor advocates, prevention educators, crisis service managers, licensed marriage family therapists, volunteers. Lovely to see volunteers attending the training, program directors, community ed, supervisors, awesome. Assistant executive director, as a gopher, Rocky. Director of education, associate directors, longtime volunteer, a survivor advocate, fabulous, thank you. Mark, I'm sure you are contributing mightily to the training of additional new volunteer advocates, and so on. And then the Learning Our Legacy video, I think you can actually see that on YouTube. I think that's available actually on YouTube. Somebody has it on a tape. I love that. And I think that the Compassionate Care, did you say this already, Sarah, that Compassionate Care is through the California District Attorneys Association, that should be, acquired through them. Again, these are not required, but we like to encourage as a way of instilling a particular kind of continuity in how we pass on our movements knowledge to utilize that content. Thank you so much for the birthday well wishes. And I think this is also a very interesting question. With moving your training online, does that mean that you get to increase the number of participants in your training? Hannah mentioned that you had 22 in your last training, so it'll be interesting to see if that is going to increase the number of your training participants. Sarah?
So I am, thanks very much. I am sharing the polling results. It looks like about, you should be seeing that on your screen now, and it looks like about 75% of folks who answered the poll have access to subject matter experts for these units, no problem. A couple folks said no. Some folks said some topics yes, some topics no, and there are about 13% of folks who are unsure as well. So if this is a barrier for you, you can always reach out to us for training and technical assistance. We can try and thought partner with you to suggest some strategies of getting subject matter experts. So let us know how we might be able to support in that with brainstorming. Also for the folks that are unable to get subject matter experts, I think you can feel free to pose that question in the chat if there's a particular barrier surrounding that. We'll also be going into some breakout rooms in a little bit, so feel free to check in with your colleagues as well for some brainstorming around how to get access to subject matter experts for these units. So it is just about almost time for our break. We're gonna do a really quick quiz before we check out for 10 minutes. To make sure that folks have retained some of the main points here. So I will do this pretty quickly. Again, we're gonna have a polling question, and there'll be a series of 4 of them, and we will be looking at some of the regulations from CalOES. So hang tight with me one moment. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and launch the first poll for our first quiz question. You should be seeing that on your screen now. Question number 1 is, what 2 documents provide compliance information about the regulations and training standards? Is it A, the Advocacy Manual and Curriculum Guide? Is it B, CalOES How-To Guide and Training Standards on CalCASA's website? Or C, the CalOES Sexual Assault Counselor Training Application and California Sexual Assault Training Standards Trainers Guide? So please go ahead and answer the question if you're able to participate. Again, just a reminder, this is completely anonymous, so we'll be sharing the results to see how folks answered, but we won't be able to know who answered what. So we have close to 80% of folks who have answered. We usually like to cut it off when we get to around 85. We typically find with the polling questions that for whatever reason, once we hit 85, we're not going to get that many more responses. I don't know why that is. So I will leave it open for about 5 more seconds. So go ahead and just go with your instinct if you're not sure. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Sharing the results. So 87% of folks who took the poll got it right. The answer is C. You can find all of the compliance information about the regulations and training standards, everything that we're covering today, in the CalOES Sexual Assault Counselor Training Application and the California Sexual Assault Training Standards Trainers Guide. So again, the Trainers Guide was sent out in an email to folks who are registered yesterday. Each agency should have received a hard copy of that, but if for whatever reason you don't, mine is at my office and actually getting mailed to me, but we all have the electronic copy in the meantime. So just a quick note there. All right, thanks for playing, folks. We are going to launch our quiz question number 2. You should be seeing that on your screen. How many sections out of the 11 units require a subject matter expert? Is it 3, 4, or 5? Great, go ahead and get your answers in if you haven't already. We see votes are coming in very quickly. I feel like a bit like a sportscaster every time I do this.
You do it so well.
Thanks, I'm well practiced at this point. Okay, we got 79% of the votes in. Our goal is 85%. So if you haven't answered, please do so. Just go with your instinct. I will close it in about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yes, 82%. Okay, it is 4. 80% of folks got that right. 4 out of the 11 units require a subject matter expert. Bonus points if you remember off the top of your head what units those are. If that's the case, please feel free to put it in the chat. Okay, question number 3, you should see that appear on your screen right now. Which of the following must be addressed in each unit? Sexual assault trauma, special populations, or confidentiality procedures? Votes are coming in. I see some folks are putting comments in the chat as well. Yes, congratulations to Bailey from News. That is the first one that I see that has named all of the units. There might be one before that. But yes, the 4 units that require a subject matter expert are crisis intervention, particularly for suicide prevention, medical and law enforcement, and legal/court. Excellent. Okay, we have about 80% of the votes in. I am going to close this poll in a couple seconds. So this one was a little bit more tricky. Still, most folks got it right. The answer is special populations. Just a reminder, special populations are folks who have marginalized identities. We'll obviously be talking about sexual assault, trauma, and confidentiality quite a bit throughout the training, but the one that is required by CalOES is special populations. So congratulations to most of you. Okay, last question before break. See that popping up on your screen right now. What is the max percentage of the usage of AV tools? Is it A, 10%, B, 30%, or C, 20%? And just a reminder, bonus points if you want to put in the chat which 2 videos do not have to count toward your overall AV usage. What are the 2 videos that are the exception, if anybody remembers? Yes, learning our legacy and compassionate care. Great job. Thanks, folks. Okay, I'm going to end the poll in a couple seconds. So go ahead and answer if you have not already. Okay, the max percentage of the usage of AV tools is 10%. Again, that is the overall training with the exception of those 2 things and PowerPoints, of course. So thanks so much for playing our poll games, y'all. Okay, we are heading to break. Please be back at 2:04 on the dot, and we will resume then. Okay, welcome back, folks. It is 2:04, so hopefully people are returning and getting settled again. Okay, so we are gonna jump right in. We are gonna move forward in discussing Unit A, which is the first unit of the training standards, overview of sexual assault. So the time to complete this, this needs a minimum of 4 hours of instruction. We do have a media recommendation here, which is learning our legacy. Again, if I haven't said it enough times, the learning our legacy video does not count towards your overall media allowance. In addition to that, the media allowable for this unit is 24 minutes. Again, 24 minutes is 10% of 4 hours. This is if you're choosing to have your media spread evenly throughout all of the units. Again, you can use more or less here as long as you are making it up from subsequent units. And this unit does not require a subject matter expert. So we put here some desired outcomes and key concepts for volunteers. So this should help contextualize a little bit sort of what this unit is about, what we're really wanting participants to walk away from this unit being able to do, what knowledge we would have wanted them to acquire. So following the completion of this unit, volunteers should be able to identify some of the root causes of sexual violence through an intersectional lens, using the information about the history of the rape crisis movement in the United States, as well as distinguish among the various types of manifestations of sexual violence. So we'll talk about that more in just a moment. An additional goal of this unit is to train volunteers on how to discuss the dynamics of consent in relation to sexual violence, of course, as well as the immediate and long-term effects of trauma from sexual violence, and also to identify elements of a trauma-informed and survivor-centered response. So these are kind of your broad and high-level concepts of what we'll be wanting participants to walk away with after Unit 1, or Unit A rather, of the training standards. Okay, I'm gonna hand it over to Leah to get us started and kind of dive into specifically what we will be discussing in Unit A.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. So in understanding that these are the training standards, right? These are the minimum criteria that our sexual assault programs and organizations need to cover with a degree of competence in order to be not only in compliance, but to prepare your organization and your advocates to be able to engage with survivors and other members of the community as needed, okay? So everybody thought it was a good idea to start with the history of the rape crisis movement. Makes sense, right? You wanna make sure that your advocates understand that the rape crisis movement, as we understand it here in the United States, the rape crisis movement was an outgrowth of the women's movement, right? And if we understand that the women's movement took off when do we think about the second wave feminism and the women's movement? Yeah, very good. Late 60s, early 70s. I'm so proud of all of you. And the women's movement is occurring at the same time as all of the other rights movement, kicked off by and large by civil rights organizing. Then you had, in addition to civil rights, you had women's movement. And then we have a host of other movements, rights organizations happening at the same time. A lot of political activism happening. We have LGBTQ movement. We have United Farm Workers. We have Indigenous American Indian movement. So we have all of these folks fighting for rights. At the same time, we have counterculture, which is this push against the previous generation, anti-war, so on and so on and so on. So a lot of conversation around rights and justice and equity exploding all across the country at that time. And out of that, we have this organizing of women. And as they identify what are the concerns of women, violence as perpetrated by the patriarchy, right, becomes a thing, becomes a movement of its own. So it's very important that your advocates understand this, if for no other reason, that they know that they are moving into an existing movement, right? That they are coming into an existing movement and they are going to be part of a legacy of work that predates their arrival as it relates to your own sexual assault program or organization. So it's very important that they understand that they are, in essence, we are handing a mantle to them that they will then carry on forward. You want them to know that they are belonging to a body of political activism that has been around for 5 decades now. Now, of course, that had precursors and antecedents to it as well. But if we understand it as the women's movement coming out of the late 60s and early 70s, second wave feminism, and how rape crisis comes out of that, right? Comes out of, birthed out of activism, right? It's also equally important that they understand that the history of and the role of women of color in all of that, because as the quote women's movement is rising and emerging, this idea of women, or the category of women, is understood as white, heterosexual, middle class, Christian, and so on, right? And so, and as a result, the movement began to be built around the needs of white, middle class, heterosexual Christian women, and so on. Well, that left out a whole lot of other women. And you have anti-racism activism happening at the same time as you have anti-sexism activism. And so you have these efforts coming together where the women's movement is being challenged to think more deeply about this category of women and what do we mean by women's movement, right? So it was women of color activists at that time who are challenging these ideas of feminism and the women's movement to be inclusive, to reflect the totality of what women, right, and to complicate or to expand on this idea so that people don't just dial in or default to dominant culture, which was white, middle class, right? And your advocates need to understand that part of that activism is spurred on and informed and reshaped by the activists of women of color at this time also. So there has always been this relationship, sometimes converging, sometimes diverging, sometimes conflicting around racism and sexism, right? But if you are doing anti-rape work in this country, you need to be doing anti-racism work also, right? So your advocates will need to understand that that's part of the work that they're doing, right? You will also want to make sure that your organizations or your program's history gets situated within that larger timeline. Your advocates, again, they are joining an existing effort. You want them to have a sense of belonging and a sense of pride and knowing that they are part of a long-standing effort, right? So that they get to come in and get a little bit of juice because they are joining, you know, the work of the leaders that preceded them, right? Make sure that you are giving your organization the appropriate credit for what your organization has done and your organization's position or your program's position within your community. You want your advocate volunteers to comprehend that as they go out into the community and talk about your organization, as they represent your organization, as they answer the phones or they go to the hospitals or they go to court, wherever they're going out and speaking on behalf of the organization, they need to know your agency's history. Because at any time, somebody might say, well, who are you? Well, we're with this organization. We've been around for this period of time. You want your advocates to always operate from a place of knowledge, right? So they need to know what they're joining. They need to know your organization's philosophy, and they need to be able to represent your organization. So you've got to give them your agency's history. It's very important that they know that. It's important that they know the history or where this idea of having coordinated community responses come from. That is also extremely important for them. You can go back to Duluth in 1980 and Battered Women's Movement and how those folks pulled together, Battered Women's Program folks, cops, lawyers, DAs, public defenders, medical professionals to have a comprehensive conversation about the needs of survivors. It was very clearly a best practice, and it has been taken up and shared, since then. Right? It certainly was used in previously, but it appears we can mark that appearance in the late 70s, early 80s in Duluth. So these are the kinds of things you want your advocates to be able to pass this information on, but you also want them to know what they're talking about, right? So beyond working with individual survivors, they will have to communicate with other people. They will become your next round of trainers, right? So you got to give them that kind of foundation. Very important. Okay, next slide. Okay, it's extremely important that your advocates understand the prevalence, not only of what's happening around sexual assault, sexual violence nationally, but grounded in the local community, right? That they must be able to ground their understanding of what's happening in and around with your local community, right? So you're gonna have to make sure that you pull up your local stats, if that's United Way, your county, your city stats, wherever you can pull them from, but that you are giving them a clear picture of the prevalence and the demographics of folks who experience sexual assault. You want to make sure that your advocates, again, speaking from a place of knowledge, because they're constantly having to educate people, constantly. When they go to church, if they go to school, wherever they go to family events. Oh, you're still doing that volunteering at that little women's organization? I don't know if y'all had that. I still get that from family members, right? And you want them to be able to advocate not only for the needs of survivors, but advocate for the movement, right? So they've got to be clear on terms. You want to make sure that they are knowledgeable and are able to parse or make distinctions between the various ways in which sexual violations can occur. Much of it is borrowed from legalistic language or borrowed from, criminal legal sector in terms of making these distinctions between rape as opposed to sexual assault, as opposed to sexual battery, as opposed to lewd and lascivious, as opposed to molestation, as opposed to forced anal oral copulation, right? Your advocates need to be able to make these distinctions, not only so they can come from a place of knowledge, but a lot of your survivors will not call their experience rape. They will not call their experience sexual violence. They know something's wrong. They're calling a hotline. They're asking to talk to you after a presentation, right? But they will not have necessarily the vocabulary, right? And so your advocates will have to pay attention to what they're listening to and then be able to have an appropriate response for that. And again, a tip, don't let your advocates tell potential survivors that, yeah, you were raped. I'm hearing what you're saying. It sounds like to me this happened. You're expressing these kinds of symptoms. Where we work, we call that sexual assault, right? So that you begin to educate them, right? So, but your advocates need to become very skilled at being able to name things in such a way so that the people they're communicating with can grasp those concepts. And then you also want to be able to have them identify occurrences or experiences that may not necessarily be criminal, but nevertheless are violations for people who seek your services. So for example, as part of people who are experiencing abusive relationships, especially a lot of teens, maybe the abusive partner is forcing them to watch porn, forcing them to watch really violent, bad porn, right? And it's having an effect. And you now have the survivor that is wanting to know how to deal with that, right? That they are understanding things like sexual exploitation of children, of minors, sex trafficking, and so on. Of course, sex trafficking is all kinds of illegal. But again, you want them to be able to have a very broad understanding of the various ways in which they may come to your program or your organization seeking clarity and assistance and help to deal with what may have happened to them or a loved one or a friend. Okay, next slide. Okay, again, we used to call this rape trauma syndrome. Lots of folks don't call it rape trauma syndrome anymore, but we hold on to things, right, as part of our institutional and our cultural memory continuity. But you want them to be able to understand what the symptoms are, because your survivors will call and say, I think I'm going crazy, right? Your advocates need to be able to validate the fact that it's okay that your survivors are having certain experiences and feeling certain things, right? Sleep disruption, eating disruption, anxiety, other kinds of physiological responses to sensorial stimuli, light, scent, smells, touch, and so on. They're gonna be describing these things, and your advocates again need to be knowledgeable in being able to say, oh, okay, it is expected, it is common that you would have that kind of reaction, that they would have difficulty in recalling the order of events, especially if we're understanding that we're having a trauma-informed approach, right? We understand that trauma affects the brain and people's ability to recall. So your survivors are understanding, I don't understand why I can't piece this together, right? They have to come from this strong foundation of knowledge. And so we find that these are all, of course, the best practices locally and nationally. with regard to this kind of advocacy, this kind of grassroots community-based advocacy, right? And then your advocates have to be able to offer options for what's happening in the immediate, what will happen in the aftermath, and how you may continue to experience flashbacks, triggers for years to come. And you want them to be able to prepare survivors for what might come down the road. You want them to have a breadth of knowledge, and this is why CalOES is requiring our agencies to make sure we adequately prepare advocates for this kind of work, this kind of intervention. Next slide, please. And I realize I'm going very quickly through these. And in working with marginalized communities and dealing with folks that identify with groups that have been historically oppressed. And I'm going to talk more about this later on, but your advocates need to understand that a dominant position is not the only position, right? And that they will need to take into consideration certain interventions that may not be well received with certain populations. So for example, calling law enforcement, it's not an option in many communities, many diverse communities that have histories of marginalization and oppression, right? Access to health insurance, just go to the doctor, right? These are the kinds of things people will have to pay attention to and understand that certain populations do not have access to these kinds of resources, right? So as they're making emergency plans, as they are working to build people's sense of getting their power back, their advocates will have to understand that there will be cultural considerations, usually as a result of some kind of systemic or institutional barrier, right? That they will have to work, they may have to dig extra deep or let the survivor guide them about what is acceptable in terms of their advocacy and their healing and their empowerment and what have you, and know that culture and belonging will play a role in that, okay? And I think that's the last slide for Unit A. Is that correct? Should we try one more?
That is correct. And you can see, as indicated by the icon in the top right, that we are going to scoot into breakout rooms for just a couple of minutes. So for those of you who haven't used breakout rooms before, although I'm sure the vast majority of you have, I'll stop sharing my screen for a moment. I will send us all into a random assortment of breakout rooms. We'll be in groups of about 3 to 4 for this particular exercise, and we'll only have a few minutes. We'll be in those breakout rooms for about 5 minutes. And we would like for folks to discuss the following. The first prompt is, why do we need to center the history of the movement when training sexual assault counselors? Why is this important? And secondly, what are some strategies that you might use to provide this information? So as we said, we'll be developing a curriculum later. We're not talking about implementation or activities today. However, while you are in the breakout rooms together, if there's anything that anyone wants to share, a particular strategy or implementation tool that you really like, you can discuss that a bit as well. So I will be...
And make it available to the rest of us.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And let me go ahead and get us into our rooms.
How long did you say we were going to have in our breakout rooms?
We'll have 5 minutes. Thanks for clarifying. Maybe I didn't say. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open these rooms and send folks out, and we'll see you back here in just a couple minutes, 5 minutes to be exact. Okay, folks are coming back. We are almost all the way back. Okay, and here we are. All right, so we are going to move into Unit B, which is discrimination and anti-oppression. So again, the time to complete this unit is minimum 4 to 6 hours. The media allowable, so 10% of this entire unit would be 24 to 36 minutes, depending on whether you're doing your training for 4 hours or 6 hours or somewhere in between. And this unit does not require a subject matter expert. So again, the key concepts that we have here for volunteers: desired outcomes, what we want folks to be walking away with. Following the completion of Unit B, volunteers should really be able to understand and kind of eloquently discuss the intersection of sexual violence with discrimination and oppression, which some of your framing around the history of the sexual violence movement should also be a nice segue into this from Unit A. This will include the role of implicit bias and power and privilege, not only in legal systems, but also in direct service advocacy, so that how that is living for volunteers and their dynamic in their work with survivors. An additional goal of Unit B is to clarify next steps to increase awareness of how personal identity, so the identity of the advocate or person providing service, and cultural programming might affect an advocate's interactions with survivors, and to highlight specific actions that an advocate can take to strive toward culturally responsive care and humility. So some things to keep in mind. And back to you, Leah. You're on mute.
As much time as we spend on Zoom these days, right? You think, okay, so this Unit B, again, discrimination and oppression. It's a deeper dive. For those of you who've been around for a while, you may remember how we used to do cross-cultural day, right? We'd have like a panel of folks come in representing a cross-section of ethnic, racial, sexual identity, ability, folks that would come in and talk about this is what sexual assault is this is how sexual assault experience in the Black community. And we would do that. And, you know, it was important that we have voices heard and what have you, but where the shift here is understanding how we want to make sure that advocates are able to address or be aware of the larger macro, as Michelle would say, or the political elements or the institutional and systemic elements that contribute to or create greater risk for communities around sexual violence, right? So how the systems and institutions create the conditions that put certain populations at greater risk for not only victimization, but also for perpetration, right? And at the same time, how those systems and institutions then function or have barriers for people in their need for help and healing after an act or incidents of sexual violence or perpetration, right? So you want your advocates to not only have the ability to deal with clients or survivors or consumers, however your organization speaks about that population. Not only be able to deal with them on a one-to-one basis and deal with their immediate healing needs and planning needs, but understand how systems and institutions, right, create additional barriers for survivors who are looking for services, and that how those systems and institutions create the conditions for, right, increased risk for sexual violence, for victimization and or perpetration. Okay, so someone asks in the chat about how do you talk about perpetration related to oppression, right? So maybe we should just, maybe if you'd like, we can do a whole, just a whole webinar or series of webinars that is specifically dealing with this. I think that's a great question, Amanda. And just know that the EDs for all of the rape crisis centers are digging in around this also, right? So it is our goal to provide people with as much skill as needed in being able to really get to this, because you're going to get survivors that are going to call on the hotline and they're going to say, I was raped by X, pick a race man, and I hate all of those people because that's the way those people are. My attacker was a Black man, and everybody knows that Black men are rapacious, violent offenders, and so on. And your advocate will need to be able to lift them up out of that conversation and that way of thinking, right? And get them to see that, you know, you don't have to go into a whole thing around institutional, but you want your advocates to be able to pull them up out of this thinking that says that it's just about race or what have you, right? We don't know, but you want your advocate to be able to speak eloquently around those kinds of things. You want them to understand that people experience life through multiple axes of identity, right? You don't get to sit one down and today I'm just going to be a woman in the world, whatever that means, right? I'm not going to be Black. I'm not going to be dominant culture, American English speaking. No. You have multiple axes of identity that you are experiencing life on a daily basis, right? We do not separate out those identities, right? One may be triggered or activated, right, in a particular kind of way, but if it's activated, it brings all of the other identities along with it, okay? So you want your advocates to be able to recognize when that is going on and how to address that. You want them to be able, number two, you want them to understand that historical traumas, right, are carried forward to the present day. Historical traumas that have been part of the cultural experience, collective experience and cultural memory of marginalized groups are carried forward. They are passed on, right? What happened back in slavery, there's an oral tradition, right? And then there are the vestiges of slavery that remain today in the United States, right? So this is main reason number two, why your advocates need to be able to understand how discrimination and oppression will work along this route, why it's important as we talk about it in sexual assault. And you also want them to be able to speak from a place of, you want them to understand that doing the work of ending sexual violence needs to be perceived and experienced and acted upon as also about undoing other forms of oppression. Because if we want to end sexual violence, we can't just end it for one population. We want to end it for everyone. And ending for everyone means that we have to pay attention to what are the conditions and what are the barriers that make populations at more risk than other populations. What are those barriers that make people's responses inequitable and make justice inequitable, right? So your advocates will need to be able to at least address that with dispel some myths around race and racism, or sex and sex, whatever's going down. Your advocates will need to be able to talk intelligently with your survivors, right? Because your survivors will go all over the place about these kind of things, right? You want to make sure that you are making culturally appropriate community referrals. If your organization, I can't tell you the number of times that I have heard people at rape crisis centers in the state of California saying, we don't have any people of color in our community. We are in an all-white community. Okay, I'm not invested in disproving that. But if you have survivors, but then that means that you will tend to build your services and resources around the sameness that you witness or say that you are experiencing in your community. So what happens when difference calls you up? What happens when difference walks through the front door, right? If you are not skilled in doing that, you want to make sure you have relationships in the community with other organizations or entities from whom you can make appropriate referrals, from whom you can build your own organizational capacity, right? To be able to address and serve different and marginalized groups, This needs to be intentional and ongoing. If we are complacent, we have lost sight, right, of the political side of this work, because it's the political side that gets us through the prevention pieces. Okay, it's the political side that helps us attack the systemic and the institutional pieces, right? So we do our individual work with individual survivors, with their family members, with their significant others, with a friend who's calling for a friend, right? So we know how to do that. But then your advocates, and there's a reason they're called advocates, right, will have to also be able to take on the political aspect of the work when they're sitting in a SART meeting and a police officer says, well, you know, those people, rape is really foreplay for those people over there, which the first time I heard, I was so stunned, I didn't know how to respond, right? In one of those kind of advocacy meetings. And I had to go away and think about it. And then I brought it up the next time I was in one of those because I was so hurt and offended by that, right? That's, you know, right? Those are the kinds of pushbacks. Those are the politics. That's where the advocacy happens at the macro or the systemic or at the institutional level, right? And then the role plays. You want your advocates to, this is the first time they're having these kinds of discussions. You want them to internalize this content. You want them to internalize this information, and they've got to get it up on its feet. And you want them to start practicing with you and the other advocates where it is a safe place, right? Michelle says that she's been focusing on historical trauma lately and collected many resources. And if anyone is interested, please email Michael, email Michael. But Michael, I would ask that you also, whatever you have, that you share them with myself and Sarah, because then we would like to then redistribute all of that as part of the curriculum material that we will be using to go along with this. So in the meantime, go ahead, do it now, but then make sure you include us or we reach out to you to acquire some of that, because again, it's very important to us that all of this content material reflect the hard work that folks at the grassroots level are engaging in, and that it reflects your needs and that it reflects your communities, right? We don't want to go and pull stuff. We want to make sure that your voices and your experience are represented in that curriculum. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Sarah, you want to, there, okay.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so we are going to go in our last breakout room of the day. I know that we did kind of a crash course in Unit B, but we wanted to give folks a little bit more time to discuss some of the pieces around discrimination and anti-oppression, particularly as it pertains to sexual violence work and the training standards. So we have a couple of questions to get you all thinking. The conversations, of course, can go where they go. We're not necessarily saying that in 7 minutes, which is how long we have in these breakout rooms, you have to do like a deep and thorough political analysis of each one of these. But we want to get folks thinking and in conversation together around why do advocates need to be aware of their own internalized biases. This is going to be a big part of the Unit B work, is not only looking at oppressive systems as these things that that exist out there, but also the way that those things manifest inside each one of us, the way that that contributes to implicit bias, and the ways in which we're all complicit in upholding and maintaining those systems. So again, the kind of short of that is, why do advocates need to be aware of their own internalized biases? Second, we'd like folks to discuss, what do you need to effectively address issues of oppression and discrimination? Particularly, as Leah was saying, folks who see themselves as being part of an all-white or mostly white community, rape crisis centers in rural areas, but folks everywhere. What do you need to effectively address issues of oppression and discrimination in this training for your advocates to be effective in this way? And lastly, and very simply, are there barriers? What are they? That can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. So this time we're going to do things a little bit differently, because when we come back, we're going to do a quick share out, like a rapid fire lightning round share out. So in your groups, please take a moment in the beginning when you get settled to assign a note taker / reporter. So what the role of the note taker / reporter will be to kind of scratch some notes down regarding the kind of top points, high level points of your discussion. And then when we come back, that person, there'll be a representative of each group who will share for just 30 seconds to a minute on some of those high level points. If you do want to type out your notes and you want to share them with Leah and I, or share them in the chat, so that we can kind of use that to inform how we build out the curriculum pieces for this unit when that happens, that would also be super helpful. So if you want to be able to send them electronically, please be sure to do that. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'm going to stop sharing right now and send you all into breakout rooms. Our groups will be a little bit bigger this time, probably about 8 folks and 9 or 10 groups, so that the share out goes a little bit quicker. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open up the rooms now. Folks have been assigned. So you should see something appear on your screen, and just click that and it will take you to your breakout room, 7 minutes. And I will give folks a 1-minute warning before we're closing.
Am I going into a breakout room?
Hmm?
Am I going into a breakout room?
No, I guess not.
I mean, I was invited to join breakout room 1.
Oh, I don't think, yeah. It just automatically puts people places.
How come I can't copy stuff that is in the chat? I can just copy it. I should have written it somewhere else first. The thing I put in the chat, I should have written it somewhere else first.
Hmm?
What I dropped in the chat, I should have written it somewhere else first. And so now I can't just copy it and paste it.
All right, welcome back from your breakout rooms, folks. we cheated. We were just about 30 seconds shy of 7 minutes. So I'm sorry that I stole that time back from you inadvertently. But hopefully you're able to have some discussion nonetheless. We only have a few minutes left, but to close us out before we drop the survey link, do we have recorders/reporters who are willing just to take 30 seconds, give us like the quickest highlight reel of some stuff that came up in your breakout groups? I know it's very awkward on Zoom to like be the one who chimed in first, so we have to have that like 45-second lull of people deciding they're going to be the first one to speak. But yeah, please just unmute yourself and go for it.
Okay, this is breakout room 8, and so we discussed internal biases mostly. We need to be culturally responsive by being aware of your internal biases. You'll hopefully avoid alienating clients and also disempowering clients. And overall, the advocate will provide better care, better service to their survivors, and better service of the organization.
This is Rocky. I think we were 4. At any rate, we was discussed that these exercises are important because oftentimes with our volunteers, it's the first time they've even been asked the question about their own personal biases. And we want them to not only understand that and know that of themselves, but also challenge their behaviors and how they handle that. The other thing, the importance of knowledge, is we can do a lot of harm if we don't have this conversation with our advocates, as we're, obviously entering into people's most horrible time in their life. And so it's important that our advocates are prepared and aware. And finally, and I think this one's so important, is that it's extremely important not only to do these conversations with our volunteers, but anyone that works with us, our staff, everyone, because whether we, unless we acknowledge it and realize that we do have biases, and don't address things that are happening, it creates a really horrible atmosphere within the agency where biases are clearly happening. I hope I did my group proud. That's it.
Thanks, Rocky.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Jen.
Oh, okay. I was in group 3, and we really only got to the first question, but we spoke about like how checking yourself first is really important in order to better serve survivors, and that if we're not aware of our biases, then that limits survivor options, like when we're interfacing with them. Also, that the system, is not broken, it's built on inequity, and we have to acknowledge that, especially, we didn't really touch on this, but especially because our roots of advocacy are often systems involved. So I think that's really important. And then, we also want to avoid like trauma bonding with the person based on our own experiences, and be open to and check our bias against people we disagree with, even if they're not experiencing oppression in the same way as other survivors we're serving. If we're not fully serving the person in front of us, then we're not doing our jobs.
And so I was in a group, I believe it was 7, and we discussed actually the same thing. This could have been a much longer discussion, and everybody had a lot of really good points. But overall, we discussed the fact that everyone has some sort of, group that they have a bias against, as long as they acknowledge it, understand it, and educate themselves so that they don't bring that forward when they are working with a victim. As we all know, racial oppression is big, and once again, educating ourselves and acknowledging that's really important. They also discussed certain terms that are used, such as those people, and terms that are often used can certainly be considered derogatory and bias. As far as the barriers to training, typically the biggest one is the lack of open-minded people. You definitely have to be open-minded and be open to educating yourself. to be able to get out of your individual bias or bias as a group. And then lack of resources, and also certain communities, you know, that are not as diverse. Some communities tend to be more anti-LGBTQ, and again, acknowledging those communities and being able to acquire training materials that help open people's minds, but also recognizing those that are not open-minded and maybe encouraging them to, you know, do something else.
Nice.
I was in group 2, and I'll make it quick because I know it's 3. And we talked about a lot of the similar things that everyone talked about, but one of the things we also talked about in terms of challenges is someone in our group was saying that some of their volunteers are folks who actually work within law enforcement systems. And so holding both that if you have someone working within these systems, there's a lot of changes, and they've seen a lot of good changes happen because of that. But at the same time, holding the fact that as a larger system, for example, law enforcement is, you know, systemically oppressive and racist and all the things. And so how do you hold both of those, and how challenging that can be? And then also time. Like if you want to do this intentional and in a really thoughtful way, sometimes there's just not enough time to do it. So how do you, again, balance both to be able to do that?
Great. Great.
Okay. All right, folks, we are right at 3 o'clock. I dropped a survey link in the chat, so please go ahead and take that on your way out. Again, we really appreciate the feedback and kind of moving forward with these sessions, seeing what you all need to be able to successfully implement these topics. Any remaining questions? On that note, any remaining questions, please feel free to email myself or Leah. Again, this is also not the last time we'll be meeting, so we really hope to see you in the following sessions 2 through 5.
Which,
and I'll put my email in the chat too.
the next one is this Friday, correct?
Yes. Thank you. Happy birthday, Leah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
So much. Looking forward to seeing everybody this Friday. Take care. Thank you, everyone. Birthdays.